Hello and welcome to our program. My name is Mark Kligman. I'm the interim director of the Yunus and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. The Nazarian Center is situated at UCLA's International Institute. Our center provides academic discourse and addresses Israel's history and culture, both past and present. The program is sponsored by the Nazarian Center and in coordination with Tel Aviv University's Alliance Center for Iranian Studies. Our program today is the first in a series of 3 series that is organized in coordination with both the Nazarian Center and Tel Aviv University's Alliance Center for Iranian Studies. In today's program, we invite you to input your feedback and questions in the Q&A box. This event will also be recorded, which can be viewed at a later time. First, I will introduce our presenter and then our moderator. Our presenter is Meir Litvak. He is professor at the Department of Middle Eastern and African History and director of the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. He is the author of several books, and his recent book, Know Thy Enemy: Attitudes Towards Others in Modern Shia Iranian Thought and Practice, was published by Brill in 2021. Our moderator is Luke Yarbrough, who is a scholar of pre-modern Islam, particularly in the Middle East. He is associate professor in the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Culture. His research interests include inter-religious relations, hadith studies, Arabic historiography, pre-modern state administration, and manuscript studies. Professor Yarbrough has also published a critical edition and translation of a polemical treatise by a disgruntled Egyptian bureaucrat entitled The Sword of Ambition, New York University Press in 2016, and he also has edited 2 volumes. Once again, we invite you to put your feedback and questions in the Q&A box. And without further ado, Professor Meir Litvak, we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, and I'm very happy to be here. And I will start my talk. I just want to share my presentation about Iranian anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Let me start by saying that Iran is among the few countries in the world that openly and unequivocally call for the elimination of Israel, and where support of Zionism is a crime punishable by death according to the Iranian Penal Code. And by the way, people were executed on this charge. Now, Iranian official spokesmen usually say that Iran distinguishes between anti-Zionism, which is a racist, imperialist, violent movement, or an offshoot of Western imperialism, and Judaism, which is a religion which Islam recognizes. But in fact, as I will try to show in this talk, the Iranian official discourse is suffused with explicit anti-Semitism. And also, I would say, one of the worst manifestations of anti-Semitism today in the world. Now, there is a certain paradox if we analyze Iranian-Israeli relations. Iran and Israel do not share a common border. There is no territorial dispute between them. They do not compete with each other economically. And in the past, under Mohammad Reza Shah's Pahlavi rule, in fact, they were allies or partners. Now, there is certainly serious strategic rivalry between them and deep animosity, which led also to direct military clashes for the first time since 1979. Now, the Iranian animosity to Israel can be shown by the slogans "Death to Israel," which is chanted in every rally in Iran, every Friday prayer in every place. Also with the slogans or inscriptions, "Israel must be wiped out," "Israel bayad mahshavad," which is written on Iranian missiles and also again on posters and slogans. Iran established Jerusalem Day or Quds Day, Ruz Quds, every year, the last Friday of Ramadan, which is supposed to rally the entire Muslim world against Israel. Now, There's a debate among scholars whether or not the Iranian animosity toward Israel is merely a foreign policy instrument, or is it something rooted in the ideology of the regime. Those who advocate for the instrumental aspect of this policy argue, correctly, that animosity toward Israel helps Iran build a bridge between itself, a non-Arab country, and the Arab world, between the Shias, who are a minority in Islam, Iran is a Shia country, and the Sunni majority. That is true, but by itself, it does not explain the huge volume of anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic activity and talk in Iran directed at Iranian audience, that is, at its domestic audience. And therefore, I would argue that the animosity to Israel is first and foremost ideological. The anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish discourse is found again in writings and statements of the most senior leaders of the Iranian regime, from supreme leader downward, in scholarly books, in hundreds, if not thousands of articles published by the Learning Complex, in pseudo-scholarly TV discussions where academics explained made certain various arguments against Zionism and Judaism, and also in government newspapers. And again, let me cite the American-Iranian scholar or Iranian-American scholar Karim Shajatpour, who written that there are three fixed principles in today's in the ideology of the Islamic regime in Iran today. One is enmity to the US, the other one is enmity toward Israel, and the third is the application of Islamic dress code on women. Now, the root of the ideological animosity of Iran toward Israel is found in the writings of Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, the major ideologue of the Islamic Republic. He has been attacking Jews and Zionism from the 1950s, but in his but you can see it also in his most important ideological tract, the book called The Rule of the Jurist, or Islamic Government, published in 1970. Already in the first page of this book, Khomeini writes that Islam was afflicted by the Jews from the moment of its inception, because, he explains, the Jews had conspired against the Prophet Muhammad, and they used various ploys and stratagems against him. 3 pages later, he continues, and he says that in the modern world, the Jews have allied with satanic groups that are even other groups that are even more satanic themselves, that is the West, and the Jews and the West wage a war against Islam, because the Jews and the West understand that Islam is because of its laws and its values, is the most powerful obstacle to their desire in intentions to dominate the world. And also they want to prevent Islam from fulfilling its historical destiny to spread all over the world. Because of the abandonment of Islam, very much as a product of Western Zionist conspiracies, the Muslim world is in such a bad state. And he explains, therefore, that Zionism is the culmination of these two conspiracies or efforts against Islam. The Jewish conspiracy that goes back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Western Jewish conspiracy in the modern period. Zionism is the meeting point, convergence of these two conspiracies. And he says also that had not the Muslims abandoned Islam, then a bunch of wretched Jews would not have been able to take over Palestine from its rightful Muslim owners. He therefore explains that it is a religious duty incumbent upon all Muslims to fight Israel and bring it to its elimination. After Khomeini's death, his successor, the current supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, has pursued the same line and added of its own. Khamenei, for instance, describes Zionism as a satanic conspiracy by the West designed to split, to fragment the Muslim world so that the West would dominate it. He also describes Zionism as the greatest manifestation or the greatest moral injustice in the 20th century. he repeatedly been saying that Zionism and the West are the two greatest enemies of the Muslim world. And therefore, of course, it is Iran's duty to fight Zionism. Now, in 1991, October 1991, Khamenei submitted a peace offer to the Middle East conflict, in which he explained generously that Iran does not call for the extermination of the Jews. Of course, Iran rejects any peace agreement, peace treaty between the Arabs and Israel. And the alternative which he offered was that to hold a referendum in Palestine among its original or authentic, he used the word asli in Persian, among the original or authentic inhabitants of Palestine, which means the exclusion of the Jews who came after the so-called Zionist invasion. And they would decide by democratic means, as practiced in Iran apparently, about the fate of Palestine. And he is certain that being a Muslim people, they would decide that Palestine would become a Muslim state. Under such a Muslim state, the Jews who are living in Palestine today will go back home. That is, they will go to the countries where they came from, to Israel, except for a small minority that will be allowed to live under Muslim rule. Since Israel had rejected this peace offer since 1991 and insists on maintaining itself as a state, Iran's duty is to provide all the means, that is being money, weapons, training, know-how, etc., to the Palestinians, to the Arabs, so that they would fight Israel, would bleed Israel, and would bring it to its knees until it accepts the Iranian peace offer. And basically, this has been Iranian policy since 1991 to the present day. Because Iran would not fight Israel by itself. Iran would employ, say, proxies who would do its job. As part of this argument, by the way, of explaining the animosity or danger of Zionism to Muslims, or as a means to bring Muslims together, Khamenei, for instance, argued that Israel and the US have created ISIS. They have fomented the Sunni-Shi'i clash in the first decade of this century. And again, the example is that Israel created ISIS to pit the Muslims once against other. And this is an Iranian poster which claims that the founder of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is shown here, has been in fact an Israeli Mossad officer, whose name is Shimon Elot, who is supposedly shown here during a vacation in Israel. So all the bloodshed that has been caused among Muslims in the past 20 years is the outcome of Israeli-American conspiracies. Now, I want to switch now to Iranian anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism in Iran is manifested in several ways, in several means, and I'll elaborate them one by one later. First, what you can see is borrowing of themes from Western anti-Semitism, be it the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that forged book that accused the Jews of conspiracy to take over the world, or the blood libel, that is accusing the Jews of using blood of non-Jews for ritual purposes. It is also, again, the use of anti-Semitic tropes against Israel. Again, for an example, the charge that Israeli doctors harvest organs of Palestinian children to transplant in injured Israeli soldiers or sell them in the black market. That is, this is an anti-Israeli charge, but it is using the trope of the blood libel. You can see here again how the Jews use organs or the blood of others for their purposes. Another manifestation of anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism is either denial or justification of the Holocaust. I will explain. An important theme, a new theme, is depicting the Jews as enemies of Shia Islam, specifically Shia Islam, not just the Muslims in general, and also depicting the Jews as historical enemies of Iran from the time of antiquity to the present day. Again, to show you that they speak about anti-Zionism, but in fact it's anti-Semitism, as you can see here in an exhibition on Holocaust caricatures organized in Iran. This person here is a supposed Israeli, but again, this is the typical caricature of a Jew taken from modern anti-Semitism. In this caricature, supposed caricature, it shows the gates of Auschwitz with an Israeli soldier, again, used against the Palestinians. That is, the Israelis are the modern Nazis. Again, use of the Holocaust to attack Israel is a combination of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Now, another interesting phenomenon or aspect is to what you can call Judaizing the enemy. That is to present every enemy of Iran or of Islam as being Jewish. Here to give an example, and I think it speaks for itself. The Jew, the ugly Jew, bred the US, which bred then Wahhabi Islam, the enemy of Shiism. In fact, there is an argument that the founder of the Wahhabi school, the strict Sunni school, which was served as the base of ideology for Saudi Arabia, an extremely anti-Shi'i school, the founder of the Wahhabi school, Sheikh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, had been in fact Jewish. He had been of Jewish descent. Now, the idea here is that the moment I describe anyone as being Jewish, it's a sign that he's bad. That is, the Jew, as my late colleague Esther Webman described it, is the metaphor for evil. If you depict something as Jewish, automatically everyone understands that it is bad, it is evil. Again, another example is the description of the Saudi royal family as of being of Jewish descent. And there was a slogan, popular slogan, "Oh, Ya al Saud, Ya al Yahud," "Oh, the family of Saud, oh, the Jews." The argument was that the Saudi royal family is in fact has a Jewish descent, not simple Jewish descent, but in fact they are descendants of the Jewish tribe of Banu Kainuka, which had fought the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. And this is why the Saudi royal family has sold Palestine to the British and later to the Israelis, because they are Jewish. Again, here, I don't think there's need for much explanation except for the slogan here, which says Wahhabiyat al Saud Yahud, that is, the Wahhabism of the Saud family is in fact Jewish. Now, a major point that I want to elaborate is the Iran's attitude toward the Holocaust. Iran is the only state in the world today whose most senior officials, including Supreme Leader Khamenei and former Presidents Rafsanjani and Ahmadinejad, had denied the Holocaust and at times justified Nazi action against the Jews. Iran was the only country in the world to vote against the UN resolution to declare January 27th, the day of Auschwitz liberation, as the International Memorial Day for the Holocaust. The Iranian Foreign Ministry had organized competitions of caricatures related to the Holocaust. Now, it is not only President Ahmadinejad who was known for his, you can say, outrageous statements on the Holocaust. No, in fact, it is even Supreme Leader Khamenei had established the contours of denial, of Holocaust denial, when he maintained that the Zionist has exaggerated Nazi crimes against European Jews in order to solicit international support for the establishment of a Zionist entity in 1948. Khamenei argued that the Zionists used the myth of the Holocaust in order to fight anti-Zionism, which was spread all over Europe before the war, and in order to present the Jews look oppressed, so that the Jews could then achieve their murderous goals in other parts of the world. By the way, Khamenei also accused the US of inventing and exploiting the Holocaust myth, because he argued the US wants to divert attention from its crimes in the Second World War, mainly the use of nuclear weapons, and then shift the blame toward Germany. So in fact, he presents the US and not Nazi Germany as the real culprit or villain of the Second World War. Another manifestation of Holocaust denial is by making false comparisons to other events in history. And for instance, the pragmatic former president of Iran, who often considered moderate, Akbar Afsanjani, denounced Israel as much worse than Hitler, and he stated that the Zionists killed more than 1 million Palestinians. In action, it is much worse than what Hitler did during the Second World War with the Jews. He explained that Hitler indeed committed injustice against the Jews and other groups, and indeed Hitler oppressed and persecuted Muslims, Christians, and atheists and Marxists, but Hitler killed only at the most 200,000 Jews. And the figure of 6 million Jews is a myth, is only a propaganda act of Zionists. So Hitler killed only 200,000 Jews. Israel killed more than 1 million Palestinians. Therefore, Israel is much worse than Hitler. And of course, thereby you minimize Hitler's crimes. Now, why do they insist so much on Holocaust denial? The basic argument is that because Israel lacks any moral historical justification for its existence, Israel's legitimacy worldwide is established or is based on the lie and the myth of the Holocaust. This lie enabled Israel to gain international support, and if we refute the Holocaust, then we demolish the entire moral historical basis or foundation of Israel. This is one element. Another element that in every conflict, every group in the world faces great difficulties in accepting the idea that the enemy can also be a victim. You can also argue that if indeed the Holocaust took place, then maybe the Jews have a certain claim of being persecuted and therefore that they deserve statehood. And in that case, we have to deny the victimhood and deny their claim for statehood. Now, more than that, we can also see in Iran manifestation of justification of the Holocaust. And again, in presenting presenting Hitler as defending Germany against Zionism. Again, the same Rafsanjani, in another statement, explained that the first objective of the Nazis in the 1930s was to free Europe from the evils of Zionism. And it was a justified action because the Zionists had constituted a very strong political force or party in Europe. They have caused much disorder in Europe. And because the Zionists owned a lot of property and controlled the empire of propaganda, they made all European governments helpless. Now, he speaks about the Zionists, but in fact, he is implying more about the Jews, again, who had the money, who controlled propaganda. This is, you can say, the echoing of the protocols of the Zion. And therefore, he explains, Hitler and the Nazis only wanted to expel the Zionists from Europe because they served as a major problem. And this, because they wanted to expel the Zionists, then this calamity has fallen upon the Muslims, that is, the establishment of Israel, and therefore on the Palestinians. The first goal of the Nazis was to save Europe from the evil of Zionism, he says, and here they were partly successful, but the outcome was a tragedy of the Palestinians, for the Palestinians. So again, in fact, here, Rafsanjani justifies Hitler's policies against the Jews, even though he denies the extent of the Holocaust. Now, like every typical anti-Semites, the Iranian anti-Semitic discourse contains contradictions. For instance, former speaker, parliament speaker, Mehdi Karoubi, who is also regarded now as a moderate, on the one hand, stated that Hitler's massacre of innocent Jews in Germany, only in Germany, not outside Germany, was a conspiracy of the Zionists. At the same time, he accuses the first prime minister of the Zionist regime that occupied Palestine, that is David Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion himself sent Jews to Hitler so that Hitler would be able to exterminate the Jews. So there was no Holocaust, but the Zionists also took part in the Holocaust. Now, the conclusion of this argument is that the Jews are the most corrupt people in the world, or not of this argument, also other Semitic arguments. And again, according to the late Ayatollah Muhammad Taqi Misbahi Yazdi, who I would say was the leader of the most radical faction in Iran, He says that the majority of the centers of corruption in the world belong to the Jews and Zionists. The Jews are the most corrupt in the world, and you don't find such level of corruption in any other tribe or nation, country, or region. Now, why is it so important, this emphasis on corruption? Because corruption is one of the worst crimes or sins in Islamic law. The slogan, corruption on earth, fasad fil ard, is an offense that again carries the punishment of death in the Iranian political penal code. And if you accuse the Jews of being the most corrupt nation in the world and the source of corruption, in a way, you provide the legal moral justification for, say, their elimination. Another important theme in Iranian discourse today is to describe the Jews as enemies of Shia Islam in particular. Now, let me give some background. According to the Shia tradition, the Prophet Muhammad had designated his cousin and son-in-law Ali as his heir. The Radir Khum Oasis shortly before his death. When the Prophet died, 72 days later, the leaders of the Muslim community met, and then one of the leaders, Omar bin al-Khattab, nominated his friend and ally Abu Bakr as the caliph, and thereby usurped the succession from Ali, the true designated heir. According to Shia tradition, this tragic event, called Sakifat Banu Saida, was the cause for all the tragedies and distortions that has taken place in the Muslim world since then to the present. The big question is, who is responsible for this evil act? Now, historically, she is blamed Omar, other leading members of the Muslim community, and many companions of the Prophet. More recently, in more recent years, there's a new argument that in fact the real force behind this tragic event was the Jewish organization that was operating in Medina, in the city of the Prophet, and this Jewish organization worked in alliance with Omar. Now, why did the Jews conspire against Ali? According to this explanation, because Ali, again, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, was the first to recognize the Jewish conspiracies in Medina, even when the Prophet was alive. And then the Jewish organization in Medina, Sazemane Yahudi, feared Ali. They knew that Ali would foil their plans to basically take over after the death of the Prophet, and therefore they conspired against him. The 14 evil villains in Sunni Islam, that is the enemies of Ali and of Shiism, all of them, according to this modern Shia Iranian narrative, all of them had either strong connections with the Jews during Muhammad's mission and before. Some of them are, in fact, have Jewish descent. For instance, the Jews were very close to Omar, the second caliph. He studied Torah with the Jews, even against the Prophet's explicit ban. Even when Omar, historically, expelled the Jews from the Arabic Peninsula, in fact, he did not do it as an anti-Jewish act. He did it as a proto-Zionist act. He pushed the Jews out of Arabia to bring them closer to Palestine, so to prepare their takeover of Palestine. The person who assassinated Ali is now described as a Jew. The other great tragedy of Shiism, the tragedy of Karbala, when the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, Hussein, was killed alongside 70 of his companions in the 10th of Muharram, year 680. And the tragedy of Karbala is, you can say, the constitutive event in Shia history, in Shiism as a religion. It is the victory of oppression over justice. Again, in traditional Shiism, the major villain in this tragedy is the Caliph Yazid, who epitomized evil rulers. The modern narrative places the Jews as key players in the tragedy of Karbala because First of all, because the Caliph Yazid, the entire evil Umayyad family are all have Jewish descent. In fact, they're all descendants of a Jewish concubine from the city of Sepphoris in the Galilee. Yazid, there is even a claim that even Yazid's father was in fact Jewish because his Jewish mother was a racist, wanted to have her son from a Jewish father. Or even if he was not Jewish, then Yazid was guided in his enmity toward Hussein by his Jewish Zionist archbishop of the Christian church in Syria. So we have a unique phenomenon of a Zionist Jew who serves as the archbishop of the church under Islam. If you jump to modern period, the Baha'is, that is a religion that's separate from Shiism, that are vilified in Iran, in the Shias. Again, the Baha'is have close connections to the Jews. Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi, whose movement, you can say, gave birth to Baha'ism 2 generations later, had worked for Jewish opium dealers. When Jews converted to Baha'ism in the 19th century, they did not do so because they were persecuted as Jews in Iran, but they did it as a conspiracy against Islam. The Baha'i shrine in Haifa, which you can see the picture here, by the way, the most beautiful park in Haifa, serves as a basis for Jewish imperialism. And there has been a close Jewish-Baha'i collaboration under the Shah to take over Iran. Another example of, again, Jewish conspiracy against Iran is the claim that, or is the blaming the Jews for the famine that took place in Iran in the years 1917, 1919. Indeed, there was a terrible famine in those years, throughout the Middle East, by the way. And apparently, something close to 500,000 Iranians did indeed perish in this terrible famine. Several years ago, a controversial Iranian author who published in the West, Muhammad Kolimaz, published a book based on faulty data in which he claimed that, in fact, the number of fatalities in Iran was not 500,000, but 9 million. And therefore, he blamed the British for this tragedy. The new narrative now also, if the Iran narrative has adopted what Kolimaz argued, and then brought the Jews in. Now, this new narrative started initially with some writers, you can say at the margins, but it is gradually moved to the center when it is being cited by state-owned news agencies, newspapers, etc. And the argument was that, again, that the British conspiracy that led to this famine was carried out in cooperation with the Jews, especially with the Jewish Rothschild family, the famous Jewish bankers. Why did they do it? In addition to the fact that the Rothschild family had been fomenting wars throughout Europe to make money, the Rothschild family, and we have to remember that when the British Foreign Minister James Balfour sent the famous Balfour Declaration, he mailed it to Lord James Rothschild in London, it has been a pro-Zionist family. The Rothschild family had known in 1919 that genocide would be the most effective means to weaken Iran, both in order for them to gain control over Iranian oil, but also because in 1919, they knew that in the future, Iran would emerge as the most ardent enemy of Israel, and they wanted to weaken Iran already in 1919 so that Iran would not pose a danger to Israel. That is, millions of Iranians lost their lives because of this Jewish pro-Zionist conspiracy against Iran. Now, to conclude my statements, or my arguments, I would say that the demonization of the Jews carried out in Iranian discourse, from the blood libel to the protocols, to the charges against Shiism, to the charges against Iran, and other examples which I will not bring for lack of time. It may be argued that this demonization of the Jews may be designed to legitimize their future annihilation. Again, let me point to another interesting development. A major theme in Shiism throughout history was the anticipation for the coming of the Mahdi, of the Shia Messiah, who will redeem the Muslims and who will bring justice on earth. Historically, the Shia Mahdi was supposed to fight the enemies of the Shias, mainly the Umayyads or Sunnis who would oppress the Shias throughout history. In modern times, again, a new theme has appeared, which describes the Mahdi, the Messiah, as a person who will fight the Jews. Not only would he fight the Jews, but the battle will take place at Armageddon, that is the biblical Armageddon, that is the place of Megiddo today in Israel. The battle will take place between, on the one side, the Mahdi, who will be supported by the Khorasanis, that is by Iranians, against the Jews and their allies. And of course, he will defeat the Jews and inflict death upon them, or whatever he will do. There's another important thing here. The modern Shia discourse adopted a tradition which was found in Sunni Islam, which historically did not have major place in Sunni Islam. It has taken a more important place in recent decades because it was adopted by Hamas and other Sunni organizations, which is called the promise of the tree and the stone. According to this tradition, the day of judgment will not come until the day when the Muslims will fight the Jews and kill them all. The Jews will then hide behind trees and rocks, but God will open the mouth of every tree and every rock, and they will say, "O Muslim, O slave of God, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him." That is, the end of time will not come until the Jews are eliminated. Now, this was a Sunni tradition. It had never existed in Shia Islam. But in recent years, we see more and more Shia sources citing this Sunni tradition in a way, again, hinging the deliverance of the world upon the elimination of the Jews. Now, the final point which I want to discuss is the measure of public acceptance of this discourse. Of course, it is very difficult to know in a country, authoritarian country like Iran. It is fairly obvious that some people who support the regime accept the anti-Jewish discourse. At the same time, there are other indications that many people in Iran reject this discourse, partly because they have more important things to deal with, but partly because they hate the regime, and if the regime says A, then of course they will do the opposite. One interesting example for this, I couldn't bring the photo, that the Iran government has painted on sidewalks or an entrance of public buildings in Iran, the American flag and the Israeli flag, so that every person who enters the public building will step on these two flags. They have done so on the main gate to Tehran University, and there's a photo showing how students make an effort not to step on the Israeli and American flags in defiance against the regime. That is, if you look at this discourse, certainly it presents the Iranian government. It is the official discourse. The ray of hope that not all Iranians, or hopefully many Iranians, do not accept it. But still, it does not detract from the danger of this discourse and from the threat it poses, I would say, not only to Israelis, but to Jews and others. So I will stop here, and we can then, I think, hope have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Litvak, for a very clearly phrased and thorough and enlightening and very sobering presentation. I would echo to the audience, I would echo what you're seeing in the chat. Please do feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A, and I will do my best to curate those and ask them to our speaker in due course. Professor Litvak, I wanted to start by, I'm trained as a historian, so I had a couple questions of that have to do with nuance. So you presented a very thorough catalog of anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic statements, mainly on behalf of the Iranian regime. I'm not myself a scholar who publishes on modern Iran. I'm not a Tehran regime watcher, but I've spoken to enough people like that to know that the name of the game is factions. So there are constantly different factions in the regime, around the regime, pushing different narratives, struggling for power. And beyond that, even outside the regime, it's a clerical regime, but even outside the regime, within places like Qom, also outside Iran, Najaf, within Shi'i Islam more broadly, there are many quietist scholars who are not particularly invested in vilayat faqih. So my first question then will be, what can you say about sort of different nuances of this discourse, or acceptance of it, or rejection of it, or trumpeting of it, or staying away from it among these different factions in the regime and outside of it?
Well, it's a very good and important question. I'm afraid that the anti-Zionist discourse, and to a large extent the anti-Jewish discourse, is very prevalent among many factions in Iran. Again, I try to show that even a supposedly moderate person like Rafsanjani, again, justifies the Holocaust, or Mehdi Karoubi, who was a candidate for the presidential elections in 2009, again, a moderate, denied the Holocaust and accused the Zionists of conspiracy of the Holocaust. Now, within the system, I would say it's very prevalent. Now, there are some Shia scholars. For instance, most notable is Hujjat al-Islam Mohsen Kadivar, who is regarded as a liberal, who, by the way, is in the US, he's in exile, who takes a more moderate toward Judaism. I don't think he espouses the anti-Semitic discourse, but he speaks, he uses the term the usurper regime when he discusses Israel. So again, maybe he makes a distinction between anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but he is one example. Now, I would say, yes, my guess is that there are scholars who are less interested in this. Again, if I take, for instance, Ayatollah Ali Sistani of Iraq, okay? Probably the greatest Shia scholar. Of course, he's not pro-Zionist, okay? He's not but he does not engage in anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as the Iranians. He has other issues to deal with. So you can say that for him, this is a less important issue facing Islam or Shiism. He is influential in Iraq. He may be popular in Iran, but the problem is that he doesn't have, he may be popular among certain segments of the population, but he doesn't have power. So I would not ignore him, but I would not make too much of, unfortunately, as I say, of his views or views of people like him.
Thank you. And similarly, I was wondering about the factor of time. Of course, the Palestinian cause has had ups and downs since 1979. There was, for instance, as everyone knows, a period of relative optimism between Oslo and the Second Intifada. So I'm wondering, can one trace changes in the tone of this discourse over time? At moments when perhaps there's more optimism, is it modulated? Does it reach a fever pitch at moments like, recently with October 7th and the Gaza war, when there has been, stronger conflict?
Well, first of all, Iran rejected the Oslo Accords, and Supreme Leader Khamenei promoted his peace plan in response to the convening of the Madrid Conference in 1991. That is, this was the Iranian response to the Madrid Conference that was supposed to bring peace. He said, we reject peace with Israel, we offer a more just solution. Now, there was a time when President Khatami said, we will accept any agreement accepted by the Palestinians or by all Palestinians, including Hamas. The problem is, or was, that Khatami, with all due respect to him, did not have much power. In fact, he did not control foreign policy. And, when Khatami ended his tenure, he conceded publicly that I do not have the power to implement my policy. So maybe Khatami was different. By the way, there was another person there was a person called Abdallah Nouri, who had been interior minister under Khatami, who was put on trial because he was supposedly supporting Zionism. And Nouri used to say, we should not be holier than the Pope. If the Palestinians accept an agreement with Israel, why should we, the Iranians, be against such an agreement? But this was the reason why he was put on trial. He spent 2 years in prison for making this statement. So yes, there are such people. And again, maybe at the time, of course, some people a minority within the clerics might have accepted it, but not the dominant faction. Unfortunately, the dominant faction headed by Khamenei has been, I would say, very persistent and vehemently opposed to any kind of peace with Israel or acceptance of Israel.
Thank you. Another question that I had dovetails with a question that has come in the Q&A. And again, I encourage audience members to continue asking questions in the Q&A. We'll get to those or the rest of those in a moment. But in your talk, there was a lot of hearkening back by leading clerics to the early decades of Islam, which is a a common thing in all religions, of course, to look at the early founding years and founding texts. But of course, there have been many centuries of coexistence, Jewish, Muslim, Jewish, Shi'i, since then, and many texts that have arisen from those encounters that one could read and draw inspiration from. So I'm wondering, in the discourses you look at, what role are there for those kind of intervening centuries? Are they just completely elided and forgotten about? Are they used selectively? And then relatedly, the question in the chat has to do with Iranian Jews, past and present. What are their perspectives toward this discourse? How do they experience it? How do they respond to it?
Okay, first, for the first question, yes, there was Muslim, Jewish, let's say, coexistence, etc. And under Sunni Islam, Jews did not face nearly the same persecution they faced under Christian Europe. There's no question about it. But we also have to remember this was when Muslims were on top, Jews were a minority tolerated by the Muslims. Shia Iran was less tolerant than Sunni countries. Under the Safavids, Jews suffered discrimination, some persecutions. In the 17th century, a third of the Jewish community in Iran was forced to convert to Islam. In the 19th century, we had the famous case of the Mashhad Jews who were forced to convert but remained as crypto Jews. So this, you can say, again, because this was more prevalent in Sunni Islam, less in Shia Islam, and one thing. And secondly, again, it was Muslims on top, Jews being a minority. The problem in the modern period is that Jews are no longer this, you can say, subservient minority, but because of Zionism, they challenge Islam. Therefore, the current discourse completely ignores these periods. Mm-hmm. Now, with the Jews of Iran, the Iranian position is that they tolerate the Jews in Iran, even they have, we can say, religious autonomy, because the Iranian regime wants to argue that the proper place for Jews is being a minority under benevolent Muslim rule. Therefore, they enable the Jewish community to live in Iran. They don't suffer persecutions. That is true. Now, where do the Jews stand on this? First of all, there were 80,000 Jews in 1979. There are less than 8,000 Jews today. That most voted with their feet, you can say. Secondly, there were some cases that mostly, let's say, about the Holocaust, when the heads of the Jewish community dared protest very mildly against blatant Holocaust denial. At the same time, they openly manifest their anti-Zionism. That is to show we are good. We don't link us to Israel. Is it done genuinely or out of fear? I don't know, but this is a common phenomenon. That is, they want to keep themselves. We are different from the Zionists.
I see. That's very, very interesting. Another question that has come in the Q&A is a little bit, it's outside what you talked about directly, but maybe it's the flip side of the phenomenon that you're studying in Iran. And that is Sunni anti-Semitism likewise based on a theory that Jews are plotting with Shia against Sunni Islam? So, you know, the Iranian clerics may say, okay, Wahhabism is hatched by, it's a Jewish plot. Is, like, you know, Khomeini himself accused of being a Jewish agent, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. True. You're absolutely right. The tragedy of the irony is that every faction blames the Jews for supporting the other faction. I apologize that I forgot the name, but an interesting book described that if you look at the about 32 sections or not sections, groups in Islam, and usually the popular narrative is that attributes every one of them to a certain Jewish figure, that they are responsible for all the splits in Islam. So this is a common theme, and you're right that Khomeini is accused of conspiring with the Jews. More so, by the way, there has been an anti-Shia, anti-Iran publication called The Protocols of the Elders of Qom. It's the first time you take an anti-Semitic document and you use the same title, but now blame the Iranians. So you can say that, yes, indeed, both sides sometimes share anti-Semitic themes, and sometimes, again, use it to attack the other side as being Jewish.
Thank you. That's fascinating and sort of fills out a larger picture of this discourse in a larger part of the world. Another, you know, so several questions have come in. One is just perhaps you could comment in response, just sort of stressing, you know, the extent to which there is, as you mentioned right at the end, a lot of popular opposition to the regime, especially following the Mahsa Amini protests, you know, of 2 years ago, and you know, the Life, Women, Freedom movement, and the extent to which, you know, the clerical elite anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic discourses you're talking about are not necessarily reflected in the population and may even have the opposite effect. So I suppose maybe to make a question of that, you know, you commented a little bit on popular acceptance of this. Is there really any way, kind of scientifically and from a scholarly, using scholarly tools, I don't know, surveys or online research or something, to measure the degree of popular acceptance of this discourse, or are we mainly going by hints and indications?
Unfortunately, it's very difficult, I think, to carry out a scientific study on this issue. What we have is anecdotal evidence. My estimate is that probably most Iranians, you know, may not like Israel because they see on TV certain pictures, but they are not. They have much more urgent things to worry about on their daily life. So they don't, you know, they don't wake up in the morning and say, you know, we have to think about this. There are certainly people who are, because they hate the regime, taking a different position against Israel. Let me give you some anecdotal evidence, which I don't know how much it says. 2 weeks ago, an important Iranian scholar, who is, you can say, legitimate opposition, Dr. Sadek Zibakalam, argued that the majority of Iranians today hate the Palestinians and sympathize with Israel because, again, they hate the regime. Several months ago, in various sports games, the speaker before the game told the people, you know, stand up for a moment of silence for Palestine. And there were shouts in the stadium against the Palestinians. How much does it say? It's difficult to say. I mean, how does it mean? But there is anecdotal evidence, yes, that the anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic discourse is rejected by quite a few people. How many of them? It is impossible to know. People would not tell. I mean, you can't conduct an opinion poll in Iran, expect people to be honest, you know, to a person who talks to them on the phone and says, you know, I represent a polling company. What do you say about the Jews when you may find yourself in jail after you speak? So it's very difficult to say. But again, we have some anecdotal evidence.
And maybe to make the question somewhat more specific and extend it, as you mentioned, prior to 1979, the government of the Pahlavi Shahs had good relations with Israel on a foreign relations basis. And there's still, particularly in the United States, there is still, pro-Shah sentiment, monarchist sentiment, and people who write in Persian, maybe outside Iran, are articulating those viewpoints. Can you comment at all on the stances toward Israel taken by that, relatively small community who would not sympathize with the Islamic Republic?
Under the Shah, yes, there was a close relation between Israel and Iran. Unfortunately, I would say the relations were close with a narrow segment of Iranian society. For instance, if you look at Iranian popular literature in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, you can still find anti-Jewish tropes. Not only the writings of Sadek Hedayat, who was openly anti-Semitic, but even in movies by Ibrahim Golestan and others, you can see some anti-Semitic tropes. There's also, you can say that since 1963, as there is growing animosity in Iran toward the Shah, toward the US, Israel is associated increasingly with the Shah and the US, and that creates more animosity with Israel. It was manifested, by the way, in two soccer games, 1968, 1972, when the Israeli team played against the Iranian team. And the level of animosity of the spectators was much higher than a regular football soccer game, including signs, Hitler is waiting for you, or the gas chambers are waiting for you, etc. So I would say there were, again, a certain segment of the Iranian population was probably pro-Israeli. Many were anti. Probably, again, if you look at the Iranian diaspora, I would say those who were pro-Shah are probably much more favorable to Israel, but there were many Iranians who were, came to the US who were anti-Shah, supporters of various other political trends, and then some of them may entertain anti-Israeli views. That is, I would not generalize on the entire Iranian diaspora and say they're all the same. Again, but I have to admit, I'm not an expert on the Iranian diaspora.
Thank you very much, Professor Litvak. I think that we are out of time for questions, and so I will turn things back over to Professor Kligman to wrap us up.
My thanks to both Professor Meir Litvak and to my colleague, Professor Luke Yarbrough, on a wonderful presentation and discussion. And to Professor Litvak, we're so appreciative to really build this relationship with you, to collaborate. And we plan to have 2 more presentations that will take place in our spring quarter, beginning through April and May, of 2 other presentations in cooperation with the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. Thank you very much. We invite you to come to our website to see our other events, upcoming events, and past events that you can watch the many videos that we have. We'd like to announce that our next event that will take place, which will be in person, which will be with Rami Hod, who's our Glaser Foundation Distinguished Fellow for the UCLA Nazarian Center. His presentation will be on February 25th at 5:30 p.m. in the Royce 314 building, and his topic will be Challenges to Democracy and the Struggle over Israel's Soul. We look forward to seeing you at those events, and thank you for joining today.